So first we're going to go through wastewater discharges. Now the previous presentation we did was on stormwater. It was about keeping pollutants out of your discharges that are going to waters of the state. Now we're going to talk about permitting discharges. So essentially allowing certain pollutants under certain conditions to be discharged through a permit. It's a little bit different. And there we go. Okay, so again, we're in the Clean Water Act still. Section 301 of the Clean Water Act prohibits the discharge of pollutants by any person except in compliance with specific Clean Water Act regulations. And how you typically are allowed to discharge pollutants is by obtaining a NPDES permit, National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System permit. And again, these orange terms will define, as with the stormwater permitting, in Georgia, EPD issues NPDES permits for wastewater discharges. Applicable rules at Chapter 391-3-6.06. And there are basically two kinds of discharges we're going to talk about right now. The first are discharges of pollutants to waters of the state, direct discharges. An example of this, it could occur on a campus. You may have an oil water separator that discharges to a drainage ditch, that discharges to a stream. There's the potential that you could get that permitted under a NPDES permit because you are discharging pollutants. The other type of NPDES permitting activity we're talking about is the operation of wastewater treatment plants. Does any campus here operate and own their own wastewater treatment plant? I think I bet there is somebody in the system that does. I would be surprised if there's not. It's not that uncommon. Probably not a lot of them, but some facilities will be operating their own wastewater treatment plants. So that's what we'll be covering. So if you do obtain a NPDES permit that allows you to discharge pollutants, it's not an unrestricted discharge. There are certain criteria and requirements you're going to have to meet, standards you're going to have to meet for that discharge. Some of the applicable discharge standards could be numeric effluent limitations for specific substances. If you're allowed to discharge wastewater containing up to this much BOD, this much total suspended solids, this much of this particular contaminant, whatever the chemical may be. They set limitations on that. National standards for performance for various industrial categories. There are anti-backsliding regulations. If you're issued a new permit, it cannot be any less stringent than the old permit you had. You can't have a less stringent requirement. You can't have a higher allowance in your discharge. And state water quality standards may all be incorporated into your individual NPDES permit. So what does pollutant mean? What sort of things, if you are discharging them, could require a permit? And it really covers a whole range of things as you see in this definition. Dredged spoil, solid waste, incinerator residue, sewage, garbage, sewage sludge, munitions, chemical waste, biological materials, heat, wrecked or discarded equipment, rock, sand, cellar dirt, and industrial, municipal, and agricultural waste. Any of these would be considered a pollutant. So what are waters of the state? We went through this before. We won't read through the whole definition, but we realize it's really just about any kind of water body above or below ground unless it's completely contained on privately owned property. So we don't have any here right now, but some campuses may actually own and operate their own wastewater treatment plant. They may not discharge to a POTW. So in that case, what they need to do is obtain and comply with the SPDES permit, because after they treat their domestic and any sort of processed wastewater, they'll be discharging that to some water body. So that discharged effluent needs to meet specific standards that would be designated in their permit. Comply with effluent monitoring requirements and perform monthly effluent monitoring to demonstrate compliance with the requirements. Submit monthly discharge monitoring reports, DMRs, to the regulating agency, and have licensed plant operators to operate the wastewater treatment plant. So continuing with wastewater treatment plants, ensure education training requirements. There are initial and continuing education requirements for wastewater treatment plant operators, and renew the NPDES permit every 5 years. And again, not a whole lot you can talk about in advance because all the requirements are going to be specified in their individual permit, so it's a matter of getting that permit and ensuring they're in compliance with it. And it's a lot of monitoring, it's a lot of reporting, it's labeling outfalls with very specific signs. So if you have a facility like this, you just read carefully through their permit and make note of the things that you need to check, whether it be records, whether it be signage, to make sure it's all in place. Other types of regulated discharges, now moving away from the wastewater treatment plant, but other discharges that could require a NPDES permit, we have some samples here. And what you want to do if you're auditing wastewater for a campus is try to figure out whether these or similar activities are occurring, and if they are, is a proper permit in place. Some things are floor drains. Again, I mentioned this yesterday, I think we were talking about underground injection control. You want to know where floor drains are going, particularly if you're talking about older buildings or if you're in boiler plants or vehicle maintenance facilities. It's not that uncommon for them to have been piped directly to a drainage ditch or a creek or something like that. If you have active floor drains in areas such as this that are piped to a water, it would be an illicit discharge if it's not permitted. A lot of times facilities may not know where their floor drains go. It's a 100-year-old building, we don't have drawings, we don't really know, it might go here, might go there. In that case, they really might need to do some sort of smoke testing or dye testing to find out where those are going, because you do have to find out if you've got any illicit discharges taking place. Process wastes, if any of those are being discharged without a permit. Vehicle washing. If you are doing vehicle washing outside and you've got the detergents and the grease and the oil and the grit from your vehicles or equipment, it's washing into a catch basin or it's washing into a water body, that would be considered an illicit discharge if it's not permitted. So vehicle washing, if you don't have a permit, really should be taking place in an indoor area where you've got a sanitary storm drain, and then make sure that the activity is allowed by your POTW. We mentioned already discharges from oil water separators. Ideally, you connect those to your sanitary sewer system and they go there. If that's not an option, or if it's not done, you may potentially have to look into getting that permitted if EPD will permit it. Some of these things they may not allow, they may not permit. They may say, no, we're not going to allow you that discharge. You're going to have to find another way of dealing with it. So you have to look at these on a case-by-case basis. And that's why these sort of things are covered under individual permits rather than general permits. We talk about manure now. Yes.
I know we've been talking there for 3 years.
Well, now it's official. Was there a question somewhere? No? Oh, I thought. Somebody changed their mind. All right. They didn't want to stop the manure flow. Okay. So animal manures from does anybody have a significant number of farm animals on their campus? And what do you have?
Goats.
Goats? How many? Hundreds, thousands?
Hundreds.
Hundreds of goats. Anybody else? Any ag schools? What have you got there?
Pigs, horses.
Hundreds, thousands, dozens? Okay. So as we're going to see, depending on how many and what kind of animals you have, you can be subject to different permitting for the manure operations, and that's because animal manures from agriculture operations can be a source of pollutants, either from runoff from the areas where they may be pastured or congregating, or from the manure management structures such as lagoons. And it may sound kind of funny and you chuckle, but it really can be a serious problem. Just up in New York last year, there was a big commercial farm with a manure lagoon, and it was right on the St. Lawrence River. And the lagoon let loose, discharging a huge lagoon. I don't even remember the gallonage, and it ended up killing millions of fish. That farm was issued hundreds of thousands of dollars in fines. It was a very big deal. So this really is serious. If you have this kind of operation, it does need to be properly managed. EPA regulations related to animal waste management are at 40 CFR 122.23. And like most of the programs we're talking about, it's basically been delegated down to Georgia to manage, and Georgia has implemented its own regulations. There are two different type of animal operations that are regulated. You've got swine feeding operations and animal feeding operations. So a swine feeding operation is a facility where swine have been, are, or will be stabled, confined, fed, or maintained for a total of at least 45 days in any 12-month period, and the confinement areas do not sustain crops, vegetation, forage growth, or post-harvest residue in the normal growing season. So not a pasture situation, more of sort of a feeding lot setup is what you would have that would be covered under here. The rules for swine feeding operations in Georgia are at 391-3-6-20. And then other animals are all regulated under animal feeding operations. Got swine separated with their own other animals under this one. And it's the same type of definition, only applying to other sorts of farm animals instead of swine. So in determining whether you may be required to get a permit for this type of operation, you have to figure out how many animal units are at your facility. And an animal unit, you've got a factor here, for example. In a swine feeding operation, an animal unit is calculated by the number of swine over 55 pounds times 0.04. More math. Here if you've got other kinds of animal feeding operations, they get different factors. Slaughter or feed cattle times 1, dairy cattle 1.4, horses 2. Those factors are determined based upon the relative amount of manure that an animal creates. So the more manure it creates, the larger factor it has. They also have, animal units for turkeys, chicken, poultry, fowl.
Yeah.
So you calculate your animal units, and then, depending on how many you have, you may or may not need a permit. So for a swine feeding operation, if you have more than 300 animal units, you need a wastewater permit. Now that's going to be more than 600 swine. If you're talking about, say, dairy cattle, it's more than 150. So they're pretty significant numbers. So unless you're a really big ag school or you have a big operation, you're probably not going to require permitting. But I don't know whether it's possible at any of the schools. Another important factor, because one facility may have a few different farms that they operate, and they may be separated. They may not be all in one location. If they're contiguous and they're under the same operation, they're considered the same animal feeding operation. The other thing is if they maybe are not contiguous, but the wastes are all managed in a similar manner, there may be one, for instance, manure lagoon that everything gets trucked to from all 3 operations, then they're considered one animal feeding operation for calculating the number of animal units. All right.
What do farmers do with these when they want to do it eventually? Roll those over them or what?
When they, after a period of time, you have to go for a permitting fee and you close them up just like you would anything else.
Like a landfill.
I learned more today than I have in the last 2 days.
Well, animals, they're kind of fun, a little bit different.
Poop lagoons. I didn't know if such thing. Poop lagoons.
So you're all going to be fighting to get on the ag school audits now. Everybody's going to want to do that. Okay, so what do you have to do if you do need to get one of these permits? A couple different permits, but if you have an AFO, an animal feeding operation, or a swine feeding operation with 300 animal units or less, you don't need a permit unless it meets the definition of a concentrated animal feeding operation, a CAFO, under the federal definition here at 122.23. And a CAFO is an AFO that meets the federal definition of it's an AFO that meets the federal definition of a large or medium CAFO based upon the number of animals. A medium CAFO is 200 to 699. So you have to go back and look and just, so if you're not a swine feeding operation, you don't have enough animal units, you don't make it for AFO, you just want to double check the federal CAFO and make sure you're not in that. So the 2 different kinds of permit types you could have depending upon the number of animal units. If you have more than 300 and up to 1,000 animal units, once you calculate up all of the number of dairy cattle and cows and swine and everything else in their factors, you need to get a land application system, an LAS permit, from EPD 180 days prior to starting operation. If you have an AFO or swine feeding operation with more than 1,000 animal units, then you have to get a NIPIDs permit from EPD. So again, depending on the number of animal units, different permitting requirements. The permitting requirements vary slightly depending on whether you're the land application permit or the NIPIDs, but in general, the kind of things you have to do is no discharge of pollutants to surface waters except for catastrophic rainfall events, waste storage and disposal system in accordance with the Natural Resource Conservation Service guidelines, development of a comprehensive nutrient management plan by a certified specialist, and the CNMP has to be submitted to EPD, too many acronyms, for approval. Other things, you have to have a certified operator, just like a water treatment plant, wastewater treatment plant, you need a manure operator. certified by the Department of Agriculture. Specifically designed waste storage lagoons, has to meet design and construction criteria. Sampling from monitoring wells and annual reporting to EPD for NIPIDs permits only, not for the LAS permit. And notify EPD within 3 months of ceasing operation, close the lagoons within 18 months according to specific procedures.
All these rules and regulations apply is that for everybody?
Anyone that has the number of animal units in here, so your big commercial farms are all subject to this. And a campus would be too if it has the sufficient animal units.
So much to buy food these days. You have to meet all the regulations.
So- But as you can see, I mean, if they don't, there really could be some serious consequences because you generate a lot of pollutants on a farm, really do. So some audit points if you're taking a look at these programs. Determine whether the campus generates or discharges wastewaters to a sanitary sewer system. If so, what kinds of discharges do they have? Where are wastewaters discharged? Do they have an on-site wastewater treatment plant? And if so, is it properly permitted? Are they operating in compliance with the conditions? Do they have a certified operator who has all the appropriate training? If they're discharging, if they have another discharge, okay, we talked about, well, this is something, it's kind of confusing to put this here. If they have a pretreatment plant, which means they're doing treatment prior to discharging to a wastewater treatment plant, that's the next presentation. So you would look onto that if that's the thing you encounter. But the other thing is to make sure that any other discharges that are not going to their own on-site wastewater treatment plant are properly permitted if they're discharged to waters of the state. So again, things like the pool water, the vehicle washing, floor drains. This is why it's really important to ask that question, where do your floor drains go? Again, particularly boiler plants, vehicle maintenance garages, older buildings. Make sure they know where they go. You may actually have to pull drawings out. We do that sometimes on audits. Not really sure, haven't really thought about it, and they go back into the archives and pull out drawings, and sometimes you can figure things out that way. And then if you've got the animal units, then you've got to go back and figure out, is it an AFO? Is it a swine feeding operation? Have sufficient animal units to require permitting? And then are they in compliance with all of the permit conditions, nutrient management plan? So we're still within the Clean Water Act. We will finish up with this after this one, I believe. And we're talking about, as I mentioned, NIPIDs, National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System regulations for indirect discharges, or for indirect. We covered direct discharges in the last presentation. And again, this is what's going to your sanitary sewer system. POTW, publicly owned treatment works, the local wastewater treatment plant.
So where's this again?
If you keep flipping, don't go to the next section.
17?
It's backwards, the front of section 17.
Oh, it's in the back of mine.
Yeah, these are all backwards.
Oh, okay. Find it, Matt? Did everybody find it? It's in section 17. Should be. Everybody there now? If not, shout out. Okay. Assume we're all there. All right, so these indirect discharges are covered under the pretreatment regulations. They apply to wastewater discharges to the sanitary sewer system. Let me check something. Okay. And they apply to industrial users. An industrial user is anybody who's discharging other than just domestic wastewater to the POTW. So a campus is an industrial user because you are discharging other things. You've got boiler blowdown, process waters, laboratory wastewaters, vehicle wash waters potentially, all sorts of other things aside from just domestic sewage that's going to the wastewater treatment plant. And these regulations apply whether you do any pre-treatment before you send it off-site or whether you don't. And we'll get into that differentiation in a moment. There are 3 potential different levels of regulation involved in pre-treatment. Of course, we start up with the federal program where all of these originate. And it regulates industrial users through the EPA at 40 CFR 400 through 471. This again is delegated down to the state of Georgia, and EPD is the authority in this instance. The Georgia pretreatment regulations are at Rule 391-3-6-.08. And some local municipalities actually have authority for their own programs. You'll have a local POTW, which will issue its own local sewer use ordinance, and that's what you are governed by. Not all POTWs have state-approved pretreatment programs, and if they don't, then you're going up according to the EPD regulations. And I believe that in the binder there's a list of which municipalities do have approved programs. So as far as industrial users that are regulated under this pretreatment program, there are a few different kinds of categories. And as we mentioned, anybody who discharges something other than or in addition to regular domestic wastewater is considered an industrial user. There are different categories now. There's significant industrial user, and you can become a significant industrial user if you discharge more than 25,000 gallons per day of wastewater. If you're a categorical industrial user, and that's up here, they're subject to EPA categorical treatment standards, and these are specifically listed, and they're actually in the standard auditing procedure that's attached, the types of facilities that are regulated as categorical and subject to the categorical pretreatment standards. So again, a CIU is a category of significant industrial user, or if you're an industrial user that contributes to more than 5% of a POTW capacity. So you've got the POTW in town, it's receiving wastewater from dozens, if not hundreds of facilities and homeowners. If you're contributing, your college is contributing a significant portion of its wastewater, equal to or more than 5%, you could be considered a significant industrial user. And case-by-case designation. The POTW can say, just because you're sending me this kind of wastewater, we're going to call you a significant user. So typically, just industrial users are not going to require any sort of permit from the POTW. Significant industrial users may and likely could be required to get a permit from the POTW for the discharges, be a wastewater discharge permit. Most colleges and universities will not be a significant industrial user. It's pretty uncommon that you would be considered that and be required to get a permit. There is a potential, one of the categories under the categorical industrial user, those are the ones listed by SIC code, is hospitals, and also agricultural annexes. And if you're a facility that has one of these, you may be subject to the additional categorical treatment standards, but I don't know if anybody qualifies for those, because you may be affiliated with the hospital, but if you don't own it and it's not yours, then it's not covered within the scope of the audit and part of the program. So if everybody is subject to certain industrial pretreatment standards, whether you are a significant industrial user and you have to get your own permit, or whether you're just subject to this general sewer use ordinance, you're subject to certain restrictions on what you could put down the drain that goes to the POTW. In the federal regulations, they list out several criteria, several prohibitions, things they don't want going down the drain. Your local sewer use ordinance will have at least these if they've got an approved program, and they can have more stringent standards. So the ones we're discussing now, you will find at least this stringent requirement in your local sewer use ordinance, and maybe more. But to give you an idea of the kind of prohibitions they have, we have some of them listed here. Any pollutants which can cause pass-through or interference at the wastewater treatment plant. So something that's going to cause your pollutants to pass right through the treatment system and not allow it to be treated, or something that's going to interfere with the treatment process. Pollutants that create a fire or explosion hazard. They don't want ignitables going down the drain. Pollutants that cause corrosion to structural damage to the POTW or the piping systems, acids and bases. Typically, they don't want anything with a pH of less than 5. So, interesting to note, because in your labs you're telling folks that a hazardous waste is anything with a pH of 2 or less, or 12.5 or greater, your sewer use ordinance is going to have a narrower range. See here, they don't want anything less than 5. Solid or viscous pollutants in any amount that can cause obstruction to the flow of the POTW. Again, they just don't want anything messing with their process. They want everything to come in, be treated, and flow out the other end. Heat in any amounts that are going to inhibit biological activity at the POTW. They don't want you putting lots of hot water down the drain that's going to kill the good bugs at the plant. Petroleum oil, non-biodegradable cutting oils, mineral oils, petroleum products shouldn't go down the drain. Pollutants that can result in the presence of toxic gases. vapors, anything that could cause a health hazard, a safety hazard, once it gets to the plant and all of the workers at the plant. And trucked or hauled pollutants accept discharge at designated points to the POTW. So what they don't want is, and I don't know why you'd have this, but a truck full of some sort of wastewater, and you're connecting into some sort of sanitary drain and unloading a whole truckload of something. They don't want that unless it's specifically authorized. In addition to things like these, very commonly you'll find in local sewer use ordinances some sort of provision for when they want grease interceptors or oil water separators, silver recovery units, and how they want those operated and maintained. They may require specific records retention or maybe even submittal to the local sewer authority, various maintenance records and units like that to make sure they're being managed properly. So again, as Tim said, take a good look through there and see what you're actually subject to. Some folks aren't even aware that there is such a thing as a local sewer use ordinance. All right, so if you are an industrial user, and we've touched upon this, not all industrial users are required to get a permit. If you're a significant industrial user, you may be required to get a permit through the POTW. Sometimes the rules are actually written that if you're a significant industrial user, and again, all colleges, or if you're an industrial user, and all colleges and universities would be considered that, some rules actually say you have to contact the local authority and get a determination from them as to whether you're a significant user. So they sort of put the burden on you to get in touch with them, explain what you're doing, and find out whether they want a permit. So make sure you check that. If you do need to have a permit, of course, comply with the permit conditions, and it may have any of these things. Again, what permit conditions they assign are going to depend upon how much wastewater you have and what the wastewater components are. But you're going to have to comply with, of course, all the general local sewer use restrictions and prohibitions. You may have to do monitoring. You may have to submit monthly discharge monitoring reports. Could be other record keeping and reporting, as indicated, maybe something relative to a grease interceptor or silver recovery unit. And there could be additional categorical standards applicable depending on what you are discharging. So the audit points for the pretreatment program, and again, what's going down the drain into the POTW. If you do discharge wastewater to a POTW, you don't have an on-site wastewater treatment plant, get a copy of the local sewer use ordinance for the facility that you're going to audit, because you need to know what their prohibitions are, what their restrictions are, so you can make sure that they're in compliance with all of those. Make sure that any non-domestic wastewaters are allowed. And if these sort of things are not allowed, then you need to call that out. You're also going to have to communicate a lot with other auditors if this is your program, because they are likely going to see things in other areas that may apply here. For instance, whoever is in the laboratories is going to find out if acids and solvents and metal-bearing wastes are going down the drain. You're not going to be in that location. You may not find that out. Somebody who's doing air or oil and is in the boiler room may find out that they've got processed waters going down the drain there. So there has to be communication between the auditors if this is your program to make sure that you gather all applicable information. And again, these are some typical things that could be being discharged that shouldn't be, and you want to make sure they're allowed. Determine if the campus is a significant industrial user. If a permit has been obtained, are they in compliance with all of the potential record-keeping requirements? Again, just a summary here, the things you're likely to find: failure to obtain or renew a permit if required. This one almost all the time you're going to see, particularly when you talk about labs, or if you have a facility that is discharging photo-developing waste without a silver recovery unit. Those are common things that you're going to see, the acids and the bases and the solvents going down the drains. Failure to install or maintain grease traps or grease interceptors when they're required by the local sewer use ordinance. Not permitting all sources, not meeting effluent limitations, inadequate record keeping, and operator training and certification, which really is only going to come into play if you're doing, if you're under the categorical pretreatment standard. That was pretreatment. So again, we covered 3 different water programs, all related, but coming at things from a slightly different angle. Are there questions on any of those that we've covered this morning? Depends upon what your local ordinance is requiring. There's nothing specific in the federal rules dealing with that. but some local ordinances will want to see some sort of record keeping on that. And if you, depending on how it's set up, if you have routine maintenance, whether it's someone at your facility or your vendor is coming in quarterly, routinely and checking it, you should be okay. If it's something that is really kind of left on its own for a while and is not being paid a lot of attention to or gets infrequent use, it's probably a good idea. They've got some little test strips that you can check the effluent, see what the silver level is. You might want to be doing that on your own just as a best management practice.